Close your eyes and picture this. It is a crisp October morning in 1957, inside a busy Manhattan barbershop. A man is getting a haircut, relaxed, his eyes closed. The room is warm, filled with the scent of talcum powder and hair tonic. The barber's scissors snip softly. Then the door opens. Two men, their faces like stone, walk in. They say nothing. They raise their pistols. And in a heartbeat, in a storm of gunfire that shatters the morning calm, one of the most feared and powerful criminal overlords in American history is executed in the most humiliating way imaginable. This wasn't just any murder. This was the assassination of Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner of Murder, Incorporated, a man who ordered hundreds of deaths but could not prevent his own. This story is not a glorification of his evil, but a journey into the dark heart of organized crime, a chilling reminder that in the world of violence, no one, no matter how powerful, is ever truly safe. If you are ready to delve into the shadowy empire of a man they called the Mad Hatter, then listen closely, for this is the story of his terrifying rise and his brutal fall. Before we begin this dark journey, a crucial disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a historical account pieced together from numerous sources: law enforcement records, court transcripts, declassified FBI files, biographies, and mob confessions. The world of organized crime is shrouded in secrecy and myth, and details can sometimes conflict. Our sole purpose in presenting this narrative is to bring you a comprehensive and accurate account of these events, to educate and inform, not to sensationalize or glorify the criminal acts described. The life of Albert Anastasia is a tapestry woven with threads of immense violence, ambition, and betrayal, and it is this entire picture we seek to understand. The story of Umberto Anastasio, who the world would later know as Albert Anastasia, begins not in the gritty docks of New York, but in the sun-drenched, impoverished hills of Calabria in southern Italy. He was born on September 26, 1902, in the small town of Tropea, a place of stark beauty and even starker poverty. Life there was a relentless struggle, defined by hard soil and a harder existence. His father, Vito Anastasio, was a railroad worker who labored to provide for his large family, but opportunities were scarce, and the promise of a better life was a distant dream whispered about in the port towns. America was that dream, a mythical land of streets paved with gold, and it called to the ambitious and the desperate alike. For a young, restless Umberto, the confines of Tropea were a cage. He was known for a fierce temper and a defiant streak, traits that would later define his criminal career, but made him a difficult fit in a traditional, tight-knit Italian community. The decision to leave was likely not a difficult one. In the early 20th century, a massive wave of Italian immigration was washing over the United States, and in 1917, at the tender age of 15 or 16, Umberto Anastasio boarded a ship and embarked on the long, arduous journey across the Atlantic. He arrived at Ellis Island, that great gateway of hope and desperation, his eyes wide with the possibility of a new beginning. Like millions before him, he was processed. His name was officially recorded, and he stepped onto the shores of New York City. The reality, however, was a brutal shock. The streets were not paved with gold. They were filthy, crowded, and teeming with people from every corner of the globe, all competing for the same meager chances. He found his way to the Italian neighborhoods of Brooklyn, a world within a world, where the familiar sounds of his native tongue provided some comfort. But the struggle for survival was just as intense as it had been in the old country. He took on manual labor jobs, working on the docks as a longshoreman, a job that would prove to be the perfect incubator for his criminal ambitions. The Brooklyn waterfront in the early 20th century was a lawless, violent, and deeply corrupt place. It was controlled by a network of gangsters, union bosses, and political fixers who extorted money from every piece of cargo that moved through the port. For a young man with Anastasia's temperament and lack of moral compunction, it was a university of crime. He learned quickly that brute force was the ultimate currency. He joined a gang of fellow Italian immigrants, known for their willingness to use extreme violence to settle disputes and claim territory. It was here that he earned his first criminal reputation, not as a master strategist, but as a fearsome enforcer. He was strong, ruthless, and, most importantly, utterly reliable when a message needed to be sent with a lead pipe or a knife. His fellow dock workers both feared and respected him, and the established crime lords of the area began to take notice of this young, volatile Calabres who seemed to have no fear and no limit to the violence he was willing to inflict. This was the foundational period, the forging of the weapon that would soon be wielded by the emerging national crime syndicate. He was no longer Umberto Anastasio, the immigrant boy from Tropea. He was becoming Albert Anastasia, a name that would soon be whispered with dread in the underworld. The docks were a brutal school, and Albert Anastasia proved to be its most vicious and promising student. His rise from a mere enforcer to a significant power was not a slow, methodical climb. It was a violent explosion, catalyzed by a single, defining event that showcased his cold-blooded nature and cemented his reputation forever. The year was 1921. Anastasia, then just 19 years old, was involved in a bitter dispute with another longshoreman over a woman. The argument escalated, as they often did in that world, from words to threats, and finally to violence. The details are murky, lost to the fog of street legends and whispered accounts, but the outcome was starkly clear. Anastasia and his brother, Salvatore, were arrested for the murder of George Torino, another Italian immigrant. This was the moment that could have ended it all. A murder charge for a young immigrant with no powerful friends could have meant the electric chair or a lifetime spent rotting in a cell. The American justice system, however, was as porous as the docks he controlled, and Anastasia experienced firsthand the power of organized crime to warp the law. Through a combination of witness intimidation, likely payoffs to officials, and the general reluctance of anyone to testify against a man known for such ferocity, the case against him began to crumble. The key witness, the one person who could definitively place him at the scene, mysteriously and permanently disappeared, with no witness the prosecution's case evaporated. The murder charge against Albert Anastasia was dropped. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, but more importantly, he walked out with an unshakable and terrifying new credential. In the underworld, surviving a murder charge, especially in such a decisive and frightening manner, was not an escape, it was a promotion. It proved that he was not only ruthless enough to kill, but smart and connected enough to evade the consequences. It sent a clear message to every rival, every potential informant, and every powerful mobster in New York. Cross Albert Anastasia, and you will not only die, but your death will be for nothing. This event transformed him. He was no longer just a strong-armed thug. He was a man who had stared down the death penalty and laughed. His confidence, his audacity, and his perceived invincibility grew exponentially. He began to consolidate his power on the waterfront, using a mixture of strategic alliances and pure terror. He became a central figure in the International Longshoremen's Association, the powerful union that controlled all the labor on the docks. For Anastasia, the union was not a means to protect workers, it was the perfect engine for extortion. He controlled which men got work and which ships were unloaded. He levied a tax on every piece of cargo, from bananas to luxury automobiles that passed through his domain. Any shipping company that refused to pay would find its operations paralyzed by sudden, unexplained strikes, or its valuable cargo would be damaged or simply vanish. His power became so absolute that it was said nothing, and no one moved on the Brooklyn docks without the personal permission of Albert Anastasia. This immense, localized power did not go unnoticed by the emerging National Criminal Consortium, a group that would later be formalized as the Commission. Men like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky were envisioning a future where crime was not a series of chaotic street battles, but a corporate enterprise, a shadow government. They saw in Anastasia the perfect head of a necessary, if grim, department enforcement. He was the living embodiment of the ultimate sanction, a man whose very name could ensure loyalty and silence. The docks had been his training ground, but the entire underworld was about to become his kingdom. The invitation into the highest echelons of organized crime was not merely a promotion, it was an anointing. Lucky Luciano, the visionary architect of the modern American Mafia, saw in the chaotic and violent landscape of prohibition, era gangsterism, a fatal flaw, the constant. Bloody wars between ethnic factions like Joe Masseria's Italian crew and Meyer Lansky's Jewish mob were bad for business. Luciano's grand design, later known as the Castellammarese War, was not just about winning a conflict. It was about restructuring the very foundations of the underworld into a corporate, multi-ethnic syndicate. To achieve this audacious goal, he needed allies who were not only ruthless, but also reliable and shared his vision of a more stable, profitable criminal future. Albert Anastasia, with his absolute control over the strategically vital Brooklyn docks and his well-earned reputation as a man of decisive and terrifying action, was a natural and crucial recruit. Luciano and his lieutenant, Meyer Lansky, approached Anastasia, and they found a willing partner. Anastasia was a brute But he was not a fool. He understood that aligning with a powerful national coalition offered far greater rewards and protection than remaining a purely local warlord. He threw his considerable weight and his crew of loyal, hardened killers behind Luciano's faction. His role was typically direct and brutal. He was one of the key gunmen in the plot that culminated in the assassination of the old guard boss Joe Masiria in a Coney Island restaurant in 1931. This was not a back alley stabbing. It was a calculated, political hit that signaled the end of an era. With Masiria gone, the last major obstacle to Luciano's new order was Salvatore Maranzano, who declared himself the capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. Luciano, understanding that this old world title would only lead to the same cycle of war, preemptively ordered Maranzano's elimination. While the exact details of Anastasia's direct involvement are debated, his allegiance was firmly with Luciano, and his network of enforcers was a key part of the muscle that made the coup possible. With Maranzano's death, Luciano's vision was realized. The commission was formed, a board of directors for American crime, comprising the bosses of the 5 major New York families and other powerful criminal organizations across the country. It was a revolutionary concept, a governing body to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and sanction major actions, most notably murders. And for this new corporation of crime, a dedicated enforcement arm was needed, a department of death that could operate across family lines with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. This was the birth of what the press would later sensationally dub Murder Incorporated, and at its head, as its chief executioner, was placed Albert Anastasia. He was given a seat on the commission, not as a boss of a family initially, but as a national authority on death itself. His base of operations remained his waterfront stronghold, but his mandate was now coast to coast. When the commission decreed that a member of any family, anywhere in the country, had become a liability, a potential informant, a rogue operator, a disobedient soldier, the contract was given to Albert Anastasia and his team of dedicated, apolitical killers. He was the system's ultimate safeguard, the sharp, final instrument of its will, a man whose professional detachment and capacity for violence made him the most feared figure in a world of feared men. Murder Incorporated was not a random collection of thugs. It was, in the most chilling sense of the word, a business. Under Albert Anastasia's direct management, it operated with a discipline and efficiency that would be the envy of any legitimate corporation. Its headquarters was not a shadowy back room, but a bustling, open storefront, a 24-hour candy store and cafe called Midnight Roses in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Here, in the constant hum of activity, amidst the smell of coffee and candy, the nation's most prolific murder for hire syndicate conducted its daily affairs. The killers, the drivers, the scouts all reported here, looking for assignments or waiting for their next call. The core group, Anastasia's most trusted lieutenants, included men like Harry, Pittsburgh Phil, Strauss, a man who reportedly enjoyed killing with any instrument he could find: guns, ice picks, ropes, his bare hands, kid twist reels. a cunning and efficient killer who would later become the syndicate's most devastating vulnerability, and Martin Bugsy Goldstein. These men were not motivated by personal vendettas or the passions of the moment. They were salaried employees. They received a regular weekly wage, sometimes supplemented with bonuses for particularly difficult or high-profile jobs. When a contract was issued by the commission, the details were passed to Anastasia. He would then assemble a team, often choosing men who had no connection to the target, to ensure absolute detachment and to make the hit nearly impossible to trace back to its source. The planning was meticulous. The chosen killers would be given a photograph of the victim and details of their habits. They would spend days, sometimes weeks, shadowing the mark, learning their routines, identifying the perfect time and place for a hit that would look like a robbery gone wrong, or, more often, a message sending execution. The methods were varied and brutal. The one-way ride was a favorite, luring a victim into a car under false pretenses, only for him to be shot in the back seat and his body dumped in a remote location. Other times, a more public statement was required, and a victim would be gunned down on his own doorstep. The cleanup was as efficient as the kill. The weapons, often untraceable and purchased specifically for a single job, would be disassembled and thrown into rivers or buried. Cars were stolen, used for the hit, and then abandoned. Anastasia ran this operation with an iron fist, demanding professionalism, silence, and above all, loyalty. He was a strict, feared boss, but also a paternal one to his crew, ensuring their families were provided for if they were arrested or killed. Under his command, Murder, Inc. is estimated to have been responsible for between 400 and 1,000 murders across the United States. From the streets of New York to the sun-bleached coasts of California. It was this industrial scale application of murder that gave the national syndicate its stability and power. The threat of being referred to Anastasia's department kept ambitious underlings in line and ensured that the rules of the new criminal order were obeyed without question. He was, in every sense, the guardian of the syndicate's integrity, his name the final argument in any dispute. The power Albert Anastasia wielded as the head of Murder, Incorporated was absolute, but such absolute power, when combined with a temperament as volatile as his, inevitably bred a terrifying reputation. It was during this period that he earned the nickname that would follow him to his grave, the Mad Hatter. This was not a whimsical title. It was a descriptor born of pure fear, whispered by the very men who worked alongside him. The madness it referred to was not clinical insanity, but a hair-trigger, unpredictable fury that could erupt without warning, a Jekyll and Hyde transformation from calm to homicidal rage over the slightest provocation. Stories of his temper became legend within the underworld, serving as cautionary tales. He was known to fly into a violent rage if a restaurant meal was not prepared to his exact specifications, his face darkening, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper before exploding. On one infamous occasion, he reportedly became enraged with a longshoreman who had accidentally brushed against him on the dock, Anastasia beat the man so severely he was permanently disabled, all over a minor, unintentional jostle. This was not the calculated violence of the boardroom. This was the feral, personal violence of a man who believed himself to be above all laws, social and criminal. Another story, perhaps apocryphal but widely believed, told of him at a fancy dinner party where he became incensed by another guest's loud chewing instead of simply moving. Anastasia was said to have pulled a pistol and fired a shot into the table next to the man's plate, bringing the entire party to a petrified silence. This was the essence of the Mad Hatter, a man so powerful, so steeped in death, that the normal constraints of human behavior no longer applied to him. His associates, even other powerful mafiosi, were often wary around him, never quite sure what minor infraction might trigger his wrath. This reputation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it cemented his authority. No one would dare challenge him, lie to him, or betray him lightly, for fear of invoking a punishment that was not just death, but a death delivered in a fit of uncontrollable rage. On the other hand, it marked him as unstable, a liability in a world that was, under Luciano and Lansky's guidance, trying to project an image of cool, corporate efficiency. A man who could be set off by a poorly cooked steak was not a man who could always be trusted to act in the syndicate's best long-term interests. This underlying current of unpredictability would become a critical factor in his eventual downfall, as the very same bosses who had empowered him began to see his volatile nature as a threat to the delicate peace they had worked so hard to build. He was the attack dog they had unleashed upon their enemies, but now the dog was showing signs of turning on its masters. For nearly a decade, the machinery of murder, operated with grim efficiency, its gears oiled by fear and silence. Albert Anastasia reigned as its unchallenged master, his power seeming as permanent and unshakable as the stone piers of his Brooklyn docks. But every empire, especially one built on a foundation of murder, contains the seeds of its own destruction. For Anastasia, that seed was a small, wary, and notoriously talkative killer named Abe Kid Twist Relas. Relas had been one of Anastasia's most reliable and prolific trigger men, a core member of the Brownsville crew who had personally carried out dozens of contracts. But in 1940, the seemingly invincible wall of Omert that protected the syndicate developed a catastrophic crack. Relas, along with several other Murder, Inc. assassins, was arrested for the murder of a minor hoodlum named Puggy Feinstein. Facing the electric chair, Reels made a calculation that was both unprecedented and terrifying to the underworld. He decided to talk. He offered District Attorney William O'Dwyer a deal, his life in exchange for his testimony. What followed was a deluge of confessions that exposed the inner workings of the national crime syndicate for the first time. For hours, days, and then weeks, Relis sang. He detailed hundreds of murders, naming names, describing methods, and revealing the chain of command that led directly to Albert Anastasia. He provided the blueprint for the entire Murder, Inc. operation, turning the abstract concept of a national crime syndicate into a documented, prosecutable reality. The impact was immediate and devastating. Hitmen like Harry Strauss and Martin Goldstein went to the electric chair based on his testimony. The entire structure of organized crime was thrown into a panic. For Albert Anastasia, this was the greatest crisis of his life. He was now directly in the crosshairs, not of a rival gangster, but of the state, with a witness who could personally place him at the scene of multiple murders and directly link him to the conspiracy. He was indicted for one of the murders Riles had detailed, the killing of a dock worker named Joe Morris. The evidence against him, for the first time, seemed insurmountable. The Lord High Executioner found himself facing the very same system he had evaded 2 decades prior, but this time, the witness was not a frightened longshoreman who could be intimidated. He was a star informant under 24, our police guard. Anastasia's world was collapsing around him. He sat in a cell, awaiting a trial that seemed destined to end with a one-way trip to the electric chair, his empire, his power, and his life hanging on the continued breath and cooperation of Abe Riles. Abe Riles, the man who held Albert Anastasia's life in his hands, was kept under what was supposed to be an impenetrable shield of security. The police, knowing his value was incalculable, housed him on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, a building converted into a temporary fortress. He was guarded by a full, rotating detail of over a dozen police officers at all times. The plan was to keep him safe, comfortable, and talking until he could deliver his testimony in a courtroom, pointing a finger directly at Anastasia and sending him to the chair. For nearly 2 years, the system worked. Riles continued to provide information, and the net around Anastasia and other mob leaders tightened. Then, on the morning of November 12, 1941, just as the United States was on the brink of entering World War II, the unthinkable happened. Abe Riles was found dead on the pavement below his hotel room window. The official explanation was a bizarre and desperate accident. Police claimed that Riles, perhaps trying to escape, had tied together several bed sheets to form a makeshift rope, had attempted to lower himself from the window, and had fallen to his death when the knot gave way. To the public and to the underworld, the story was laughable. Abe Riles, the man who was singing to save his life, suddenly decides to attempt a risky escape from a 6th floor window using bed sheets, while a dozen armed policemen were supposedly just outside his door. The coincidence was too perfect, the explanation too flimsy. It was immediately and universally labeled a push. The most feared canary in American criminal history had been thrown from his cage. The fallout was catastrophic for the prosecution and miraculous for Albert Anastasia. With Riles dead, the case against him collapsed. The primary witness was gone, and the intricate web of testimony he had spun fell apart. The murder indictment against Anastasia was dismissed. He walked out of the courtroom a free man for the second time, his legendary invincibility now magnified to mythic proportions. The question of who killed Abe Riles became one of the great, unsolved mysteries of organized crime. The most plausible theory, one whispered for decades, was that Anastasia's allies on the commission had used their immense influence to reach directly into the police guard detail. It was rumored that key officers had been bribed to look the other way, or had even actively assisted in Relis's fall. The famous, grim joke that circulated in the underworld said it all. Abe Relis could sing, but he couldn't fly. For Anastasia, it was the ultimate demonstration of his power. He had not only survived the most serious legal threat of his career, but he had done so in a manner that sent a chilling, unequivocal message to anyone who would ever consider betraying him. There is no hiding place. You could be under the protection of the entire New York Police Department, and Albert Anastasia could still reach you. Emerging from the Reels affair unscathed was more than a legal victory for Albert Anastasia. It was a coronation. His reputation, already fearsome, was now superhuman. He had faced down the full might of the justice system with its star witness, and had won in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. In the wake of the murder, incorporated trials, the old order of the Luciano era commission was shifting. Vito Genovese, a ruthless and ambitious power broker, was maneuvering in the shadows, while Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, held sway with his political connections and sophisticated approach. Anastasia, now free and more powerful than ever, set his sights on a goal he had long coveted: formal recognition as a boss in his own right. His opportunity came through the Mangano family, which controlled the Brooklyn waterfront, among other rackets. The family was led by Vincent Mangano, a more traditional and low-profile boss, but his brother Philip was the real power and a known rival of Anastasia. The animosity between Anastasia and the Mangano brothers had been simmering for years, rooted in territorial disputes and clashing personalities. In April 1951, the conflict reached its bloody climax. Philip Mangano was found shot to death in a swampy area of Brooklyn. His brother, Vincent Mangano, disappeared at the same time and was never seen again, his body never found. It was a classic, brutal mob power play. While no one ever publicly accused Anastasia, the code of silence saw to that. There was no doubt in anyone's mind who was responsible. With the Mangano brothers eliminated, there was no one left to challenge him. The commission, recognizing the fait accompli and perhaps wary of challenging the Mad Hatter directly, formally acknowledged Albert Anastasia as the new boss of what was now known as the Anastasia family. He had finally achieved the ultimate seat of power within the American Mafia. He moved his base from the docks to a plush suite in a hotel he part-owned. The fancy and respectable-looking office befitting a corporate CEO. He expanded his criminal empire with voracious ambition, pouring his immense wealth from the docks, gambling, and loan sharking into legitimate businesses and new illicit ventures. He invested in garment factories, mineral water companies, and the burgeoning casino industry in Cuba. He was no longer just an executioner. He was a billionaire criminal entrepreneur, a man who dined at the finest restaurants, wore custom, tailored suits, and lived in a fortified mansion in New Jersey. Yet, despite the trappings of legitimacy and high society, the core of the man remained unchanged. The volatile temper, the paranoia, the ruthless instinct for violence. These were not traits he had shed. They had simply been given a larger, more powerful stage upon which to play out. He ruled his family with the same iron fist he had used on the docks, demanding absolute loyalty and brooking no dissent. The very methods that had built his power were now, in his new elevated position, becoming his greatest liability. The pinnacle of power is often the most isolated and dangerous place to be, and for Albert Anastasia, his reign as a boss was marked by an escalating paranoia and a series of strategic blunders that began to alienate the very allies who had once supported him. His volatile nature, which had been manageable when he was merely the syndicate's chief executioner, became a source of immense instability now that he was the head of a major crime family. He saw threats everywhere, and his response was always the same swift, brutal, and often disproportionate violence. He began to demand a personal cut from every criminal operation in his territory, no matter how small, squeezing his own soldiers and associates to the point of resentment. Stories of his irrational rages continued to circulate, but now they carried greater weight. He was known to humiliate powerful captains in front of their own men over minor issues, a dangerous breach of protocol that sowed deep seeds of discontent. One of his most fateful decisions involved his longtime, though sometimes reluctant, ally, Frank Costello. Costello was the archetype of the modern mobster, polished, politically connected, and a master of corruption. He believed in making money through influence and quiet negotiation, not through public bloodshed. Anastasia, in contrast, still believed in the power of raw fear. This philosophical divide widened into a chasm. Anastasia began to openly covet Costello's highly lucrative casino interests in Cuba, a venture he saw as inadequately protected and ripe for a takeover. He started making moves to muscle in, disregarding the established agreements and territories sanctioned by the Commission. To Costello, this was not just a business dispute. It was a fundamental challenge to the system of order he had helped create. Anastasia's ambition was becoming a threat to the peace and, more importantly, the profits of everyone else. Furthermore, Anastasia's relationship with Vito Genovese, another immensely powerful and ruthlessly ambitious boss, was deteriorating rapidly. Genovese, who had been building his own power base for years, saw Anastasia as an unpredictable and dangerous loose cannon. He also viewed him as an obstacle to his own grand design, to become the preeminent power in the American underworld. Anastasia's reckless moves against Costello provided Genovese with the perfect opportunity. He could position himself as the defender of the syndicate's stability, the man who would remove a dangerous liability for the good of everyone. Genovese began a quiet, relentless campaign, whispering in the ears of other bosses on the Commission, painting Anastasia as a greedy, unstable madman whose unchecked ambitions would inevitably bring down the heat of law enforcement on all of them. He reminded them of the old days of the Castellammarese War, suggesting that Anastasia was a new Maranzano, a boss who saw himself as above the rules. The seeds of a death sentence were being carefully planted. Anastasia, insulated by his own power and arrogance, seemed oblivious to the conspiracy taking shape around him. He believed his fearsome reputation would protect him, as it always had. He failed to understand that in the calculus of the commission, a reputation for madness was no longer an asset. It was a ticking time bomb that needed to be diffused. The final catalyst for Albert Anastasia's downfall was not a single, grand act of betrayal, but a slow, steady accumulation of grievances and fears that coalesced into a unanimous verdict against him within the shadowy court of the commission. Vito Genovese, a master of political manipulation within the underworld, was the prime mover of this conspiracy. He skillfully exploited every one of Anastasia's missteps, presenting them not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern of behavior that threatened the entire organization. Genovese approached Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's own underboss, a man of quiet ambition and sharp intellect. Gambino had served loyally, but he had grown weary of Anastasia's erratic and domineering leadership. He saw the writing on the wall. Anastasia's path was leading to self-destruction, and Gambino had no desire to be pulled down with him. Genovese offered him a deal support the removal of Anastasia, and the family would be his. It was an offer Gambino could not refuse. With Gambino's defection, the conspiracy had its vital insider. Genovese then secured the support, or at the very least, the acquiescence of the other major power brokers. 3. Finger Brown, Lucci's a close ally of Genovese, joined the plot. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of the syndicate, who had once worked closely with Anastasia, also gave his silent approval. Lansky valued stability and profitability above all else, and Anastasia had become a destabilizing force. Even Frank Costello, though perhaps reluctant, understood that Anastasia's ambition directly threatened his own empire and likely agreed that the problem needed to be solved. The decision was made. A contract was issued not by a single boss, but by the collective will of the commission. The man who had once been the nation's chief executioner was now its top target. The irony was profound and inescapable. The method chosen for the hit was as significant as the decision itself. It would not be a private, discreet killing, a one-way ride to some remote swamp. That would have been too kind, too professional. Instead, it was to be a public, humiliating, and spectacular execution. A message to the entire underworld about the price of arrogance and instability. It was to take place in a location that offered no cover, no dignity, and no chance of a heroic last stand. The Barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel on 7th Avenue in Manhattan was selected. It was a busy, public place, a hub of activity where Anastasia was a regular, a place he would feel secure. The plan was a masterpiece of underworld psychology, designed not just to kill a man, but to shatter his legend and serve as a grim lesson for anyone who would dare challenge the new order. Albert Anastasia, the master of the ambush, was walking blindly into his own. The morning of October 25, 1957, dawned like any other for Albert Anastasia. He was at the peak of his worldly power, a multi-millionaire crime boss living in a fortified estate in New Jersey, surrounded by bodyguards and luxury. Yet, the very routines of that power, the habits of comfort and invincibility, were about to become the instruments of his demise. He left his home, likely accompanied by his usual driver and bodyguard, and was driven into Manhattan. His destination was the Park Sheraton Hotel, a fashionable and bustling establishment at 56th Street and 7th Avenue. He had a routine. He would often go to the hotel's barbershop for a shave and a haircut. It was a place he felt safe, a public yet familiar space. The barbershop itself was a classic, masculine domain of leather chairs, mirrors, and the clean, antiseptic scent of lotions. Anastasia, a man who took pride in his appearance, settled into one of the chairs. He took off his jacket, draped it over a nearby chair, and relaxed. He closed his eyes, giving himself over to the barber's ministrations. The hot towels, the soft snip of scissors, the gentle hum of conversation. It was a scene of utter normality, a stark contrast to the violent storm that was about to break. Unbeknownst to him, the two men who would carry out his execution had already entered the hotel. They were professionals, likely hired from outside the New York families to ensure deniability, a tactic Anastasia himself had perfected. They wore scarves partially covering their faces, their hats pulled low. They moved with purpose, their steps measured and silent on the tiled floor. They pushed open the door to the barbershop. The scene they entered was almost tranquil. Several men were in the shop. Anastasia in the chair, his eyes closed. The barber, Arthur Grasso, attending to him, another customer in the next chair, and a manicurist near the back. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, the two gunmen strode purposefully across the room, their footsteps breaking the calm. They raised their revolvers, aiming directly at the reclining, vulnerable figure of the most feared mobster in America. There was no warning, no dramatic pronouncement, just the sudden, deafening roar of gunfire. The violence was swift, brutal, and shockingly public. The two gunmen opened fire at point blank range, their bullets tearing into the defenseless body of Albert Anastasia. The first shots hit him in the back, the impact jolting his frame in the barber's chair. He had no time to react, no time to fight back, no time to even fully comprehend what was happening. His eyes, which had been closed in relaxation moments before, must have flown open in a final, fleeting moment of shock and terror. The gunmen continued firing, their weapons emptying into his torso. The room, once filled with the gentle sounds of grooming, was now a cacophony of screaming, shouting, and the deafening blast of gunshots. The barber, Arthur Grasso, threw himself to the floor. The other customer and the manicurist scrambled for cover. Anastasia, mortally wounded, was thrown from the chair by the force of the bullets, collapsing onto the white, tiled floor, which was now rapidly staining crimson with his blood. The entire event lasted perhaps 10 to 15 seconds. As suddenly as they had appeared, the two assassins turned and fled, running back through the hotel lobby and out onto 7th Avenue, disappearing into the midday crowds of Manhattan. They left behind a scene of chaos and horror. Albert Anastasia, the man who had ordered hundreds of deaths, who had built an empire on fear, lay dead in a pool of his own blood, his body riddled with bullets. He was 55 years old. The symbolism of the hit was unmistakable and deeply humiliating. He had been killed in a place where he was vulnerable, with his eyes closed, in the middle of a mundane, personal task. It was the ultimate disrespect in a world where respect was everything. There was no heroic last stand, no dramatic shootout. He was executed like a sheep, and the message to the underworld was clear: no one is untouchable. The Mad Hatter had been silenced, not in a dark alley by a rival's knife, but in the bright, public light of a barbershop, by the cold, bureaucratic will of the organization he had helped build. The king was dead, and the method of his death was a more powerful statement than the death itself. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the shooting, as the gunmen vanished into the city and the screams within the barbershop subsided into panicked sobs and frantic calls for the police, the scene settled into a grim, static tableau of death. Albert Anastasia lay on the cold, hard floor, surrounded by the mundane detritus of his final moments: a toppled barber's chair, scattered hair clippings, and the sharp, coppery smell of blood now overpowering the scent of talcum and lotion. The police arrived swiftly, cordoning off the area, their faces a mixture of professional detachment and sheer astonishment at the identity of the victim. The investigation began with a flurry of activity, but it was almost immediately hamstrung by the same code of silence that Anastasia had enforced for decades. Witnesses in the barbershop, though cooperative with the police to a point, had seen very little. The descriptions of the two gunmen were vague: men of medium build, hats, scarves. No one could identify them. The barber, Arthur Grasso, was questioned extensively, but he could only recount the sudden, violent eruption and his own desperate dive for safety. The other customer and the manicurist provided similar, fragmented accounts. The story was always the same: two men came in, fired, and left. There were no names, no license plates, no clear motives offered to the authorities. The police, of course, had their suspicions. They knew this was a mob hit of the highest order. They understood the significance of the location and the brutal, public nature of the execution. They looked immediately towards the rivalries Anastasia had cultivated, towards Vito Genovese, towards Carlo Gambino, towards the entire commission. But suspicion was a far cry from proof. The underworld, true to its nature, closed ranks. No one talked. No one bragged. The killers, whoever they were, simply melted back into the shadows from which they had emerged. The case, despite its high-profile victim and sensational circumstances, quickly grew cold. It remains officially unsolved to this day, a perfect, professional murder in the annals of organized crime. The only justice served was the underworld's own brutal form of it. For the law, it was a stark reminder of the power and impunity of the syndicate they were fighting. For the mob, it was business as usual, a necessary, if bloody, piece of corporate restructuring. The vacuum of power left by Albert Anastasia's death was filled with a swiftness and efficiency that demonstrated the plot had been meticulously planned, not just to eliminate a problem, but to seamlessly transfer his empire into more acceptable hands. Carlo Gambino, the quiet, calculating underboss who had conspired with Vito Genovese to orchestrate the hit, stepped into the role of boss without a single shot being fired in opposition. The transition was so smooth, it was as if Anastasia had never existed. This was the ultimate proof that his murder was not a rogue act, but a sanctioned coup approved by the commission. Gambino, a man who preferred the shadows to the spotlight, represented a new kind of leadership. He was a strategist, a diplomat, a man who understood that immense profits could be made through patience, negotiation, and corruption, rather than through the constant application of terror. He immediately began to consolidate his power, forging a powerful and lasting alliance with his cousin and fellow conspirator, Tommy Luches. Together, they would go on to lead their families for decades, building them into two of the most powerful and stable criminal organizations in American history. Vito Genovese, the other chief architect of the assassination, also achieved his immediate goal, with Anastasia gone and Frank Costello critically weakened. Costello had survived an assassination attempt just months before Anastasia's murder, which was also linked to Genovese. Genovese now stood as the most powerful and feared boss in New York. He convened a now infamous national meeting of mob bosses in the small town of Appalachian, New York, later in 1957. A summit meant to formally anoint his leadership. The meeting, however, was raided by police, creating a national scandal that exposed the continued existence of a nationwide crime syndicate and ultimately led to Genovese's own downfall. But in the immediate aftermath of the Barbershop hit, it was Genovese's victory. The message of Anastasia's death was thus twofold. To the public and the law, it was a shocking demonstration of mob violence. But to the underworld, it was a lesson in realpolitik. It reaffirmed the absolute authority of the commission. It showed that no individual, no matter how powerful, ruthless, or feared, was bigger than the organization. The era of the wild, uncontrollable Mad Hatter was over. The era of the corporate-style gangster, the quiet, suit-wearing businessman who ordered murders from behind a desk, had firmly begun. Anastasia was a relic, a holdover from a more volatile time, and his death was the syndicate's way of modernizing itself. The legacy of Albert Anastasia is a complex and dark tapestry, woven with threads of immense power, terrifying violence, and ultimate futility. He was a foundational pillar of the modern American Mafia, a key enforcer in Lucky Luciano's revolutionary vision, and the operational mastermind behind the syndicate's most feared instrument, Murder Incorporated. His influence helped shape the underworld into a disciplined national enterprise. For 2 decades, his name was synonymous with ultimate sanction. He was the final, terrifying argument in any dispute, a man whose approval was literally a matter of life and death. He ascended from a penniless, illiterate immigrant to a multi-millionaire crime boss, a trajectory that mirrored the classic, if perverted, American dream. He lived in a mansion, owned legitimate businesses, and wielded power that most could scarcely imagine. Yet, his story is not one of triumph, but a classic Greek tragedy played out on the streets of New York. His greatest strengths, his ruthlessness, his fearlessness, his capacity for violence, became the very flaws that led to his destruction. The same volatile temper that cowed his enemies eventually alienated his allies. The same arrogant ambition that drove him to the top of the Mangano family also drove him to overreach. Coveting the empires of men like Frank Costello and threatening the delicate peace of the entire commission, he failed to understand that the world had changed around him. The syndicate he helped create had evolved into a sophisticated corporation that no longer had a place for a primal force of nature like the Mad Hatter. He was, in the end, a victim of the very system he helped build, a system that valued stability and profit above individual prowess. His dramatic and humiliating death in a barbershop was the ultimate irony for a man who had always been the hunter, never the prey. It served as the final, brutal lesson of his life in the kingdom of violence. There are no old men. No one retires, they are merely replaced. His empire was dismantled and absorbed by more cunning men the moment he hit the floor, his legacy not one of enduring power, but a cautionary tale about the limits of terror. To truly understand the enigma of Albert Anastasia, one must look beyond the bullets and the blood money and into the psychology of the man himself. What drove a young immigrant seeking a better life to become the most prolific orchestrator of murder in American history? The answer lies not in a single motive, but in a corrosive combination of personality, environment, and opportunity. The poverty and struggle of his early life in Calabria and on the immigrant-packed streets of Brooklyn cannot be understated. It bred in him a feral will to survive and a deep-seated resentment towards a world that had given him nothing. The Brooklyn waterfront of his youth was a Darwinian arena where the strong preyed upon the weak, and it was here that he learned his most fundamental lesson. Violence was not just a tool, it was the primary language of power. He was not a sophisticated man. He was not an intellectual like Meyer Lansky or a political manipulator like Frank Costello. His intelligence was raw, instinctual, and entirely geared towards dominance and control. He possessed a pathological lack of empathy, a disconnect that allowed him to view human life as a commodity to be spent in the pursuit of his goals. This was not the calculated detachment of a surgeon, but the coldness of a natural predator. His famous temper, the source of his Mad Hatter moniker, was likely a manifestation of this deep-seated pathology, an inability to process frustration or challenge in any way other than explosive, homicidal rage. The world of organized crime provided the perfect outlet for these traits. It rewarded his brutality, celebrated his fearlessness, and gave him a structure within which his particular talents could flourish. He did not see himself as a monster. In his own mind, he was likely a successful businessman, a provider for his family and his crew, a man who had risen to the top through sheer force of will in a world that understood only force. The power and wealth he accumulated were not just rewards, they were validations of his entire worldview. They proved that his way, the way of the knife and the gun, was the right way, the only way. This unshakable belief in his own methods and his own invincibility ultimately blinded him to the shifting loyalties and political machinations that would seal his fate. He was a man perfectly suited to build an empire through terror and entirely unequipped to maintain it through diplomacy. The world that Albert Anastasia helped create did not die with him. It merely evolved, and his assassination became a pivotal turning point in the history of organized crime. The Barbershop murder sent a seismic shock through the underworld. But it was a shock that ultimately reinforced the authority of the Commission. It demonstrated that the syndicate could, with cold efficiency, police its own, removing a rogue element for the greater good of the corporate enterprise. This act of internal hygiene, while brutal, was seen as necessary to preserve the billions of dollars in revenue generated by gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and narcotics. The rise of Carlo Gambino and the consolidation of power by Vito Genovese in the aftermath signaled a new era. The flamboyant, publicly violent boss was becoming an endangered species, replaced by the low-profile, corporate-minded don who operated through layers of insulation. Gambino, in particular, would become the archetype of this new model, ruling for 2 decades with a quiet, ruthless efficiency that made him far more powerful and less vulnerable than Anastasia ever was. The Appalachian Summit of 1957, convened by Genovese just weeks after Anastasia's death, was intended to formalize this new order. But its disastrous exposure by law enforcement ironically began the process of breaking the Commission's overt power and forcing it into an even deeper, more secretive existence. For law enforcement, Anastasia's murder was a stark revelation. It confirmed their theories about a national crime syndicate with a governing body that could order the death of one of its most powerful kings. The public nature of the killing generated massive media attention and public outrage, which in turn increased political pressure on agencies like the FBI to intensify their fight against organized crime. The death of the Mad Hatter did not end the Mafia, far from it. But it did mark the end of its most brazenly violent and publicly terrifying chapter. It closed the book on the era of murder, Incorporated, and its godfather, and opened a new, more insidious one where the violence was often hidden, and the bosses wore tailored suits and lived in quiet suburban homes, their power more deeply entrenched and more difficult to combat than ever before. Anastasia's downfall was, in a cruel twist, a step forward for the organization he loved, forcing it to become smarter, more discreet, and in many ways, more dangerous. The story of Albert Anastasia is not merely a chronicle of a single criminal's life. It is a dark reflection of the American immigrant experience gone horribly awry. He arrived on these shores, like millions of others, filled with the hope of a new beginning. But the promise of America curdled in his soul, transformed by the harsh realities of poverty, discrimination, and the brutal environment of the New York docks. His journey holds a grim lesson about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the inescapable consequences of a life built on violence. He is a figure who forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the society that, in part, created him. Was he a monster born, or was he a product of a system that offered limited, brutal paths to success for those on the very bottom rung? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. He possessed innate traits of cruelty and ambition, but the world of prohibition, era-organized crime provided the perfect, fertile ground for those traits to grow into a poison tree that shaded an entire nation. His life stands as an eternal testament to the fact that the pursuit of power through terror is a self-consuming fire. He built a fortress of fear around himself, but the very walls of that fortress became his prison, isolating him from trust and genuine loyalty, leaving him surrounded only by those who feared him or those who plotted against him. In the end, the fear he inspired was not enough. It could not stop the bullets in the barbershop. It could not prevent his most trusted lieutenant, Carlo Gambino, from betraying him. It could not sway the cold, calculating minds of the commission when they decided he was more valuable dead than alive. His entire philosophy, that raw, unadulterated violence, was the ultimate solution to every problem, was proven catastrophically false by his own murder. He was killed not by a more violent man, but by more cunning and politically astute ones. His legacy is a cautionary tale that echoes through the decades, a reminder that in the annals of crime, as in life, the bully, the tyrant, the mad dog always meets a fitting end. The world of Albert Anastasia was a world without mercy, and he was ultimately consumed by its most fundamental law. The echoes of Albert Anastasia's life and violent death reverberate far beyond the confines of organized crime history, seeping into the very fabric of American popular culture and our collective understanding of the criminal underworld. His story, with its dramatic arc of immigrant struggle, meteoric rise, and brutal public fall, contains all the elements of a classic tragedy, making it a source of endless fascination for writers, filmmakers, and television producers. The character of Don Corrado Prizzi in the 1985 film Prizzi's Honor, portrayed with chilling stillness by William Hickey, draws heavily from the later years of an old, paranoid, but still lethal Mafia kingpin, reminiscent of Anastasia's standing within the commission. More directly, his persona and his infamous end are widely believed to have inspired the fictional character of Barzini in Francis, Ford Coppola's masterpiece, The Godfather. While Barzini's death is orchestrated during a baptism, the character represents the same kind of old-world, ruthless, and ambitious rival that Vito Genovese and others saw in Anastasia. The very concept of a barbershop hit has become a trope in mob cinema, a shorthand for a shocking, disrespectful, and professionally executed murder. His nickname, the Mad Hatter, evokes an aura of unpredictable danger that writers often assign to their most volatile antagonists. Beyond fiction, Anastasia's reign and the operations of murder, incorporated, have been the subject of countless documentaries, true crime books, and podcasts, each trying to unravel the mystery of how such a vast, murderous enterprise could operate with such impunity for so long. His story serves as a dark benchmark, a real life example of the extremes of criminal power. He has become an archetype, the ultimate gangster, whose life proves that no amount of power can purchase immortality or guarantee safety from the very forces one unleashes upon the world. The public nature of his death ensured his immortality of a sort, transforming him from a man into a myth, a permanent fixture in the gallery of American infamy, his name forever synonymous with the peak of Mafia violence and the inevitable downfall that follows. And so, the story of Umberto Anastasio, the boy from Tropea who became Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter of murder, Incorporated, reaches its final, quiet conclusion. From the sun-scorched hills of Italy to the blood-soaked tiles of a Manhattan barbershop, his was a journey defined by an insatiable hunger for power and a profound belief in the language of violence. He was an architect of the modern American Mafia, a king who ruled through fear, and a ghost who haunted the dreams of his enemies. Yet, in the end, the empire he built with such brutality outlived him by mere moments, seamlessly absorbed by the very system he thought he commanded. His life stands as a stark monument to a simple, inescapable truth: those who live by the sword die by the sword. The fear he cultivated so carefully became the very weapon that turned against him. The power he wielded so absolutely proved to be an illusion, shattered by two anonymous gunmen in a public room. His story is not one to be admired, but to be studied and understood, a dark chapter in the nation's history that serves as a perpetual warning about the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition and the ultimate futility of a life dedicated to terror. The curtain falls on the Mad Hatter, but the echoes of his violence and the lessons of his downfall remain, lingering in the silent spaces long after the final gunshot has faded.